Good evening and welcome to the January 22nd meeting of Troy City Council. I'm Marty Baker, President of Council. Please silence your electronic devices for the duration of the meeting. We'll begin with the invocation by Mr. John Schweizer, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, on Monday we celebrated the life and teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King, who taught us to walk together in harmony. You have given us the lessons of love and brotherhood through your son, Dr. King, and countless others. Open our minds so that we may learn those lessons and walk together as you willed. We ask that you watch over all those who protect us, both home and abroad. We thank you for the first responders who, when called despite the extremes of weather, come out and aid us in need. Lastly, we thank you for protecting those that were out cleaning our streets this weekend while we were home, warm, and sleeping. And to all this we say, Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Here.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Here.
Mr. Schweizer?
Here.
Mr. Sievert?
Present.
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
Mrs. Oda?
Here.
Mr. Lutz?
Here.
Mr. Kendall?
Here.
Mr. Heath?
Here.
All members are present.
Mrs. Knight, please read a summary of the minutes of the January 7th meeting of Troy City Council.
Minutes of Council, January 7, 2019. Resolution number R1, 2019, regarding use of internet auction sites to sell surplus property was given first reading and was adopted. There was a presentation by Kelly Snyder, the Executive Director of the Troy Rec, who provided an update. Council adjourned into executive session at 7:25 p.m. and then adjourned at 8:05 p.m.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes?
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Twist to approve the minutes. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
We have no committee reports this evening, I do not believe. And so we open the meeting to citizen comments at this time. Does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments related to the agenda items this evening? If so, please come to the microphone and state your name and address. There's a 2-minute time limit at this point in the meeting, and Mr. Kerber is our timekeeper.
Lester Connor, 1210 South Clay Street, Troy, Ohio. I'm really surprised that you're going to waste $5,000 on another consultant when there's people in Troy that is in position that's smart enough to be able to decide whether or not to extend the moratorium on the free parking. I mean, wasting another $5,000, it just don't make sense. You people are capable of making these decisions. It should be, you know. If you want to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money, then don't throw it away like that. You just make a decision without a consultant all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have no resolutions this evening. So Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 01, 2019.
Ordinance number 01, 2019, an ordinance amending ordinance number 054, 2018, extending the declaration of a moratorium on the enforcement of section 351.15, the enforcement of prohibitions against the parking of motor vehicles for periods of less than 2 hours, and section 353.12 of the codified ordinances of the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This extends the current parking moratorium through March 31st, 2019. First reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspension.
I'll second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Heath to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
I'll move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Heath and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 02, 2019.
Ordinance number 02, 2019, an ordinance to accept the application for the annexation of certain territory containing 6.1241 acres more or less in Concord Township to the city of Troy, Ohio. Council previously approved legislation related to this annexation. It has now been approved by the Board of County Commissioners, returned to the city of Troy for final approval. This property is located off Union Street. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions from
Move for
council?
suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Kendall to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes. Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any questions or comments from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
That completes the business portion of tonight's meeting. Mrs. Knight, are there any communications or announcements?
There are none.
Mayor Beamish, do you have any comments this evening?
Very briefly, I want to thank Mr. Swazer for his invocation tonight and all of us that were a part of the Martin Luther King walk and service that took place. I thought it was a very positive and upbeat day yesterday. So thank you very much. You represent us on that King team. Thank you. That's it.
Mr. Titterington, any comments this evening?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one brief one based on the public comments, citizen comments on the agenda items. Just to clarify, even though it's been passed and the moratorium extended, the consultant's purpose was not to advise you as to whether or not to extend the moratorium. It is to take the data that's been gathered during this time period, analyze it, collate it, and then make a presentation to the council. The mayor had advised that we, nor Troy Main Street, the merchants, all the interested parties, we didn't want to make these recommendations knowing that there may be different opinions on it. And so bringing this gentleman in who does know parking and data analysis, those kind of things, could advise you as best. The 5,000 is a not to exceed number. It's not a blank, it's not a check that we write to that amount. It's a not to exceed, and again, it's on the authority of the mayor that we did that. So I just want to clarify that. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I have nothing for this evening. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Any comments from council members this evening?
Yes, Madam President.
Mr. Schweizer?
I would like to thank Joanne Anderson and Shane Carter from the Lincoln Center for really making the Martin Luther King Day yesterday possible. There was probably 40 to 60 brave-hearted souls that walked down Main Street to the police station and prayed with the police. Fortunately in the Sally Port where it was a little bit warmer. And And then we marched on to Troy Methodist Church and had a great service there. And then went across to First Place and had a great meal provided by Fazoli's. So I want to thank those people. I also want to thank some of the unsung heroes I think that we have in the city are people who you know, we say every week we say thank you to the police, we say thank you to the fire department, but no one ever talks about the street department. And to get out at 3 o'clock in the morning and start plowing streets, and all you're looking forward to is another 8 to 13 hours sitting in a plow. It is not glamorous. You're in heavy outerwear. The defrosters are going at full speed. It's dark out a lot of times. They're watching out for automobiles that are driving on the road. They're watching out for parked cars. And again, they're at 3 o'clock in the morning while we're all home in bed asleep. I don't think that anybody says thank you enough to those folks. So anyway, Mr. Mullins, I think you're here. Thank you. And that's all.
I'll pass that along.
Would you please?
I will.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Marty, if I
Mr.
may.
Kendall.
And not to continue going on the Martin Luther King Day, but I think we also ought to recognize that in addition to those from the city who were there, you had Lisa Reddick, who represented the city well with her vocals.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So I think hats off to her too.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else on council have any comments? Any comments from city staff this evening? Anyone in the audience have any comments? Thank you all for attending tonight's meeting. Have a safe and peace-filled week. Meeting adjourned.